Okay, welcome back. Now, that sickness I underwent last weekend has thrown things behind, so um, we have to do something to catch up. So I'm going to do a lecture on Aristotle's physics today, and I'm going to do it just like I would do if we were conducting a live course with a whiteboard. I would just walk right up to the board and start writing down the things you need to know. So that's what we're going to do. So Aristotle was the student of Plato. Okay, he hailed from um, northern Greece. Uh, we call it Macedon. Okay, and settled in Athens. Was noted as a great genius, or as a person possessed of an extraordinary intellect, and he was sent deliberately to Athens because of the reputation of Plato. His father, Aristotle's father, that is, was a court physician for the court of Philip, the father of Alexander the Great. And of course, Philip himself forged the military machine that his son inherited and which he exploited to the purpose of conquering most of the known world at that time. Okay. And at least from the standpoint of the Greeks, right? Um, Aristotle, we can infer, given his aptitude for intellectual matters, um, would have learned the art of healing from his father. And that's a rather important thing to remark upon because Aristotle, pardon me, the art of medicine, right, in antiquity included a kind of physics built into it, and likely would at least, at the very minimum, have included Empedocles. I mentioned him earlier in the course. Empedocles' account of air, earth, fire, and water, and how these things turn into one another, perish, and are replaced by a subsequent basic element, and how they can combine to form various types of what we would call chemical compound. Um, and so he probably had that under his belt, not to mention the science of rhetoric, you recall Thrasymachus, um, which he would have learned after the death of his father. Aristotle's father died when he was 11 years old. And his education was then taken up by his uncle, who did train him in rhetoric. Anyway, so he spent 20 years studying with Plato, okay? And studying in Plato's academy. He left to travel in Ionia and in the islands of the Aegean. Here, he, in effect, founded the science of biology. I should have mentioned, while in Plato's academy, we believe there he founded the science of logic. Now, we looked at Plato rather carefully and we saw that with Plato, clearly, Plato understood the principles of logic. Otherwise, what he wrote would be impossible. But oh, by the way, remember Ionia. Ionia is Turkey, okay, Western Turkey. So Aristotle was the first person to reduce logic to a set of definite principles and then to have articulated those principles in a series of treatises that we call the Organons. That's so important, I'll put that down. He was the first philosopher to have reduced logic to a science. Which science? He, sort of a science of science, as it were, he laid out in the series of treatises, collectively called the Organon. Okay? and that would include his categories, his on interpretation, his prior analytics, and his posterior analytics. Those four, and the topics, excuse me, and the topics, those five. So I'm not going to type all those in. In his mature thought, Aristotle distinguished between theoretical philosophy practical philosophy. Practical philosophy, we have ethics and politics, okay? And the philosophy of production. And there we get a poetics, which means literally an account of production, but that was a treatise on poetry. Now, in principle, you could have a poetics of painting, and a poetics of architecture, and a poetics of sculpture, and a poetics of dance, right? And a poetics of music. In principle, you could have all those things. All he produced was one poetics, a poetics of drama, and indeed only one type of drama, that is tragedy. By the way, the word drama, it's a Greek term, refers both to tragedy and comedy. Okay. So he distinguishes between these three different branches of philosophy. Theoretical philosophy is divided in book 6 of the so-called metaphysics into first philosophy, and this seems to be okay, which is the study of being. Second philosophy, which is our concern today, the study of coming to be. Well, let's just say the study of becoming. Okay, I'm just going to put it in a way that's intelligible. And mathematics. Okay. And I said theoretical. Let's just make that theory. Okay. And with mathematics, he doesn't call it third philosophy. And that was his one shot to do so. And if he wanted to call it third philosophy, he would have called it third philosophy. So apparently, mathematics is outside of philosophy. Might be important, right? But it was just, for him, a non-philosophical pursuit. Okay. Okay. You don't have to accept that, but that is seems to be what he's indicating. It doesn't quite say it. Also, he didn't write any mathematical treatises. So this is a person who devoted his life to philosophy. There's not even a single mathematical proof of anything. So it would seem that he didn't regard mathematics as part of the philosopher's, it's not part of his métier. It's not what he does. Okay. Nothing against mathematicians. Very good. So first philosophy is also called the science of being qua being. That's being as being. Okay, I think we just put in plain old English. Science of being as being. Qua is just Latin for as. The science of being as being. While second philosophy is in effect the science of being as becoming. Now I have to draw inferences in order to get these distinctions, but I'm basing this on Metaphysics, book 3, okay, chapter 1, if you want to have a look. And you'll see what I'm getting at. he doesn't say that second philosophy there is the science of being as becoming, but it's implicit in the text because he's contrasting it with the science of being as being. If you wanted to talk about mathematics now, you'd say that's the science of being as measurable, effectively, right? Okay, so our concern is with physics, right, which equals second philosophy. That is the science of things in sort, he likes to say beings, onta, onta, the science of beings. The Greek there you want to know is ta onta, okay? The beings. It's the science of beings insofar as they move. All right. So now I had you read some stuff from the physics. So that's just a brief sketch, just so you're not completely at sea and you have some kind of sense. Oh, by the way, I mean, Aristotle, I should have mentioned, right? Born in 384, and he died in, let's see here, he died in 322, okay, BC. So not a long life, but not a short life by the standards at the time. And that was enough for him to be able to more or less found philosophy as a genuinely constructive endeavor. Now you notice that Plato didn't say anything in his own words. Well, Aristotle says a great deal. I have to say that again. Plato didn't say anything in his own name. He put all of his words in the mouths of his characters in his dialogues. Aristotle wrote dialogues too, but he made himself a character in his dialogues, so you knew exactly where the author of the dialogue stood. Whatever the Aristotle of the dialogue was defending, you could be rest assured that's what Aristotle was himself defending. Aristotle also wrote effectively treatises, that is, actual books, sort of like textbooks of sorts, where he simply tells you, he lays down the questions, and then he answers them for you and tells you, this is it, this is the truth. He sometimes even says that we have now stated the truth. That's in book 10 of, book 7, chapter 10 of his Metaphysics. We have now stated the truth. Very bold, right? So he was a very serious-minded fellow. I mean, he said, well, I'm not going to simply articulate a bunch of questions and then lead people by the nose right to the edge of an answer and then pull the rug out from under them and then say, see you guys, best of luck. Why don't you try it again yourselves? That seems to be what Socrates was up to, right? No, he intends to answer the question himself and then explain why his answer is the correct answer. And we can imagine him in his context. There he would have had students. They would have asked him questions. He would have received criticism, and he would have answered the criticisms and explained why he was correct. And his treatises were largely a record of that kind of exchange. He spends a great deal of time in his treatises talking about his predecessors and, as it were, culling from them what he thinks was rational in their accounts, and then criticizing them and showing why one has to go beyond them. By the way, mention one more thing here. When he returned to Athens, he founded the Lyceum. Okay, that was his own philosophical school. So, by this point, he was well established. With funding provided by Alexander, who used to be his student. So that's quite a pairing, folks. Aristotle, later known as the philosopher, right? And the master of those who know. Aristotle was the private tutor of Alexander the Great. Okay, you can't make these things up. I mean, that's history of, that's tremendous history for you. All right, so now we want to consider the first three books of the physics, okay? So let's talk about book 1. I don't know why that's in italics, I don't know. Here, Aristotle treats of motion in terms of the distinction between matter and form. This distinction is for him a causal distinction. Now that sounds a little bit confusing, so I'll try to explain. So if you look at a bronze statue, okay, a bronze statue of Theodore Roosevelt, well, the form would be the actual shape of the statue in that particular case, and then we would give some kind of account of the relationship between the parts. You could even render this mathematically in this case. I mean, mathematics is not despised in Aristotle, and the mathematical ratios between the parts would give us an account, a rational account of the form of the statue. Now, there's more to know about the statue, and that is the bronze. So then if we gave an account of the properties of bronze, we would then have an account of further properties of the statue. So why are matter and form causal for him? Why are they causal? Well, they're causal because, okay, the bronze causes the statue to have the specific properties that bronze itself possesses, whereas the form causes the statue as a whole to possess the various, in this case, mathematical properties characteristic of that particular form. I should mention that in the case of living things, the form is actually the activities, the typical activities of life. So in a plant, that would be the activity of self-maintenance. In an animal, the activity of self-maintenance plus perception and desire and action. And in a human being, all of the above, all of the preceding plus rational thought. Okay, so that's not a matter of mathematics at that point. Okay, so here we have to understand what problem he's departing from. He is departing from the problem of motion inherited from the Milesians, who argued that motion is impossible for the following reasons. Okay? Now, we can say with Aristotle, clearly things move. He was a very succinct fellow. If you tell him motion is impossible, here are my arguments showing you why it's impossible. And he'll say, well, clearly things move, right? So let's get an account. He doesn't stop there. He says, I'll give you an account of this. So part of what he's doing is trying to save motion from arguments which claim to show that it can't exist at all. Okay. So here it is. Here's the argument from the Milesians concerning why motion is impossible. Motion has to come to be, pardon me. What comes to be, right? So we're talking about motion, we're talking about things coming to be. So what comes to be does so, right? Either A, from what exists, or B, from what does not exist. Okay, those are the only two choices. I mean, it's not like the Milesians were dumb. You know, they reasoned this out. If A, that is, from what exists, okay, then what comes to be, all right, does not in fact come to be, but already existed, right? Because what's coming to be comes to be from what exists, right? Then there's no question of it's coming to be. It already exists. So we start with being, and that's it. We don't have to move forward. If that makes any sense. If B, that is, from what does not exist, then nothing can come to be at all. Why is that? As from nothing, nothing can come. Okay? So you can imagine yourself staring out into a blank space. And we can grant there's nothing in it. And I can ask you, okay, what's going to emerge out of that blankness, that nothingness, that void? What could come out of that? And the answer is clearly nothing. So we have two choices. Being either comes from being, in which case it does not come from being, it simply is throughout, you follow? Or it comes from non-being, in which case we've uttered a contradiction. Nothing comes from non-being. So therefore motion motion does not exist. In either case, motion does not exist. Okay? And this is not Aristotle, this is the Milesians. In either case, motion does not exist. In case A, there is, how can I put it? There is, what's the word I want now? Changelessness, stability, fixity. Okay? In case B, there's nothing whatsoever. And that's that. So now Aristotle, he replies to this in the following way, okay? So here we go. Aristotle says that whenever we witness change, because clearly things change, we can all grant that. What we witness is one thing coming to be in something else, okay? So what we witness is the coming to be of, let's say, a certain quality in something. So a person puts on a bathing suit, he gets on top of his roof, and let's say it's warm out, it's the middle of July, and just lays there in his bathing suit for 12 hours a day for 2 weeks, okay? So whatever he looked like to begin with is one thing. After that, he will have, relative to his original pallor, he'll have acquired a tan. Close the door. Sorry, my son can't interrupt. After that time, he will have acquired a suntan. Okay, so what happened there? There we have a being, this person, who acquires what was not there before, okay? The individual can be counted as what you call a substrate, okay, or a substratum. What he acquires is a form, and that's one contrary. What does he acquire it from? He acquires this relative to his privation. So motion consists in the transition from a privation in, so to speak, a substratum, to the positive presence of the form in the same substratum. Okay? Hence, the principles of motion are three. As he says, two contraries and a substratum. And I would ask you if you can think of a counterexample to this. You can think of any kind of motion which involves which departs from this particular conceptual structure. Even if you take a billiard ball and move it from one space on the pool table to another space on the pool table. Well, the substratum in this case is the billiard ball. That's the one thing which persists throughout. Okay? And at first it occupies one place. That's the, as it were, accidental property of that billiard ball at that moment. And then you move it, you hit it with your cue stick, and it bounces around a bit, and it ends up in a different space. And now it has acquired a new accidental property of occupying that second space. Making sense? It's still one and the same billiard ball. Okay. So what has happened is it has one and the same thing, the substratum, has proceeded from the privation of the second space. What's the privation? That's just the lack, the not having of something. It has moved from the privation of the location it ultimately ends up occupying to that location itself. Okay. So I should emphasize this substratum remains constant throughout. In a way, the substratum doesn't move, right? So hence, let's put it this way. Aristotle then responds to my lesions in the following way. Motion is indeed from being, but in a qualified sense. All right. Namely, it is from the substratum plus a privation, right? In this connection, the substratum is the being, which itself does not change in its essential nature. Okay? Okay. But motion is likewise from non-being. Let's see what we got here. I lost my place. In a qualified sense, as it involves departing from a privation as its starting point. Okay? And terminates in the possession of the contrary form. Okay. So there can be no motion at all if there's not something in which the motion occurs. That's the substratum. And likewise, there would be no motion at all if there were nothing but a substratum. There's a substratum, a privation, and then the transition from that privation, which is the absence of the form, to the actual possession of that form. Okay. If there were not something constant under change, right? If they're not something constant and fixed throughout a change, then motion would be nothing other than shear replacement. And this is a problem people do wrestle with, okay? I mean, the mere fact, some people think that, you know, maybe this account is not entirely convincing because the substrate, of whatever that is, let's say you have bronze and you're fashioning it into the shape of Theodore Roosevelt, and the bronze remains, right? Because it's still bronze throughout. It's the same properties of bronze. As it's being changed in shape, and eventually you pour it into the mold, and then you take the mold off, and then you let it dry and cool off, and then you have a statue. Some would say that, well, from moment to moment, right? The bronze at one particular moment replaces the bronze at the previous moment. So there's a kind of shear replacement going on. Aristotle doesn't look at it that way. Okay, Aristotle doesn't look at it that way. It's a little bit slippery, I have to say. But in the case of the statue, the bronze, in and of itself, okay, whatever those properties are, in virtue of which it reflects light and has solidity and so on and so forth, that actually doesn't change ever. You guys follow me? The actual inner essence of the bronze, in virtue of which it is bronze, that doesn't change. That is what it is. Nonetheless, we definitely perceive change going on, right? What's that? That's change in the external accidental properties attached to the bronze. That is change in the shape of the bronze, not of the bronze itself. The bronze is constant. Does that make any sense? And in itself, as bronze as bronze is not change. Just that. It's just that. It's bronze. But then it can change in shape. It can change in place. And you can heat it up, I guess, and change its quality. But there's still something there which eludes change, which is the foundation of change. So it can get a little bit slippery, but maybe there's something to that, okay? All right, so that's his way of handling that. Book 2, here, he defines nature as a principle of motion and rest in a thing. Now, here's the important part. I will give you the Latin now. Qua itself. Okay? So, what does he mean by this? An artisan can cause something to move, as it were, to undergo changes, like the bronze. And in that case, the bronze is not moving in virtue of itself. It's moving in virtue of the activity of the artisan. You guys follow? Because there is no lump of bronze that will spontaneously shape itself into the shape of Theodore Roosevelt. But there are bronze sculptures out there who can take bronze and shape it into the shape of Theodore Roosevelt. In that case, what we're looking at is art, not nature. Okay, so you might say that art would be a principle of motion and rest in a thing qua other than the art, I guess. But he never really defines it, so I have to make it up myself. Nature would apply to something more like, let's say, a koala bear. Okay, so you begin with mommy and daddy koala bear, and they conceive a new koala bear. And now there's a baby sort of koala bear in the womb of mommy koala bear, and it's developing. Okay, and at first it's you know what these look like. First it's a clump of cells, and then it looks like a little bit like a seahorse, and then it gets more and more definite, and eventually starts looking like a koala bear, only really, really tiny. And then it just kind of grows, and it continues to look like a koala bear, only it's getting larger, right? That whole motion, guys, that's the motion of nature right there. A principle of motion and rest in a thing that is the koala bear, baby koala bear, qua itself. I mean, there's a principle of motion in the actual baby koala bear in the womb of its mother. as it develops. And what is it developing towards? It's developing towards a state of relative maturity, in which at which point it'll come to rest. Okay, so the mother koala bear will give birth to the baby koala bear. For all I know, they give birth to litters. Let's say they give birth to 4 or 5 at a time. I honestly don't know. And then there'll be 4 or 5 baby koala bears, probably not terribly large, probably clinging to the mother, right? Or maybe spending time in a nest, or however they handle that. After this, I'll be looking up a koala bear documentary. So that's what nature, in fact, is. So nature, in fact, has 2 senses, and these are familiar to us. First, the primary sense of nature is form, okay? For example, e.g. means exempli gratis. It means, for example, the form of a koala bear. Because if there is no such thing as a form of a koala bear, there's no accounting for how that clump of cells became a koala bear. Have you noticed, a clump of cells in the womb of a blue whale and a clump of cells in the womb of a koala bear mother and a clump of cells in the womb of a human being? If you just look at them under a microscope quickly, they're indistinguishable from one another. So we have to account for how we get from one clump to a baby blue whale, from another to a baby koala bear, and from a third to a baby human being. You say, all of you are saying, well, it has something to do with the genes. And no one has ever accounted. There is no explanation how the genes regulate that step-by-step process of cell mitosis, and then cellular differentiation, and then morphological definition, and diversification of function, and integration of the various parts, both morphologically and functionally, so as to produce an instance of a specific kind, whether it be blue whale or koala bear or human being. There is no step-by-step account of that. But people say DNA, as if somehow DNA does that. So I sometimes wonder, because DNA, that gives us instructions to the RNA, which then produces proteins. It doesn't tell anyone how to organize the proteins into, a liver on the one hand, a kidney on the other hand, a spleen, a stomach with intestines, how to shape everything and put everything together. Where does that come in? Okay, so science still has a lot to teach us, right? So there we go. The primary sense of nature is the form. The secondary sense is the matter, okay? What's the matter? Well, in the koala bear, the matter is the flesh, blood, bone, cartilage, and all that stuff. You say, yeah, but the flesh, blood, bone, cartilage, that's all implied by the form. Okay, so Aristotle has, you have to get into his theoretical treatises a bit deeper, as I have. I did my dissertation on Aristotle, so I know a lot about this. So the form of the koala bear is actually his capacity to sense and desire, and in a sense to engage in self-maintaining activities. Okay, so the koala bear can see things, smell things, taste things, touch things, okay, and hear things. Those sensate activities belong to the very being and essence of a koala bear. I hope that's making a little bit of sense. And his capacity to desire things like food and time with Mrs. Koala Bear, if you see what I'm saying. Those also belong to the very essence of what it is to be a koala bear. But in order for those things to be, in order for those sensate activities, or sensory activities is a better way of putting it, in order for those sensory activities, in order for his motor activities, we could also add the activity of digestion, and also of the transformation of food into the things of his body. In order for all that to exist, there actually has to be a body composed of flesh, blood, and bone. Okay, so I guess that's a little bit abstract. So let me type that out for you. So the form of the koala bear includes 1, his sensory activities. 2, his desiderative. That means it has to do with desire, okay? His desiderative activities. And 3, his self-maintaining, right? His self-maintaining activities. And that is digestion and integration of nutriment so as to transform what is other into the very body of the koala bear. Okay, very good. So that's the form of the koala bear. It's a little bit, maybe, what happened here? Look what I did. Let's get rid of this. There we go. Now, the matter of the koala bear, I can't type any longer, right? Is his flesh, I guess fur, right? In his case, blood, bone, cartilage, say spinal fluid, etc., right? All that stuff. That's the matter. There has to be matter as well, okay? And the matter itself is going to exert the influence it does on the various processes that go on in the body of the koala bear. Make any sense? So in virtue of the blood, it will allow of circulatory activity. Make any sense? And in virtue of the bone, the koala bear will have a certain shape, like the bone gives it a certain kind of fixity, and then you can attach, the sinews and musculature to the bone, and then wrap all that in skin, right, flesh, and then cover that with fur, okay. And of course, we'll get some cartilage in there. You can see I'm not a big expert in animal anatomy, but I think we're getting the basic picture here. I mean, the materials of which the koala bear is composed, they, as it were, make a contribution, their own contribution, to the actual processes that occur within a koala bear, if that makes any sense. And the form of the koala bear ultimately serves as the final be-all, end-all explanation of the various activities of go on in a koala bear, because all the things that go on in a koala bear occur for the sake of either achieving or maintaining its form. Make any sense? Everything happening in you is happening for the sake of maintaining your form of human being. And with you, your form would include everything there the koala bear has, and we would add to that rational thought. Okay? Huh. There we go. All right. So, hope that's, I mean, when you think along with Aristotle, it's kind of hard to disagree with him. I mean, when you think, you have to go along with him a little bit. But he's a very commonsensical fellow, a very sensible fellow. He's just not going to buy this business that change doesn't exist. He's like, obviously it exists. Look around you. Okay, let's be sensible. And now let's get an account of this. And here it is. 1, 2. All right, so then he's not done. In book 3, I have to back up for a second, guys. Okay. In book 2, he introduces 4 causes, not 2. Okay? And these are the formal cause, Okay, I've already talked about that. The material cause. Now he introduces the final cause. The final cause is, pardon me, that for the sake of which something else occurs or exists. All right, that's the final cause. So the final cause of the flesh, blood, and bone ultimately is the form of the koala bear. Okay, or in your case, your form. And then there's the what he calls the efficient cause. That's the efficient cause is the agent that moves another thing, which is its patient and is moved. Okay? All right. So we have those four causes: the formal cause, the material cause, final cause, and the efficient cause. Okay, very good. Now, we also have spontaneity. You guys have luck and chance in your translation. I think I'll skip that for the moment. Okay, we'll come back to that. So now book 3. Here, Aristotle turns to a definition of change. Okay? And this is a different project now. Now he wants to kind of dig into the actual structure of change and explain what it is in terms of a definition. Okay, so in book 1, he took up a problem, a philosophical puzzle, and he solved it. He thinks he solved it there, showing that that is how change actually exists and what it consists in. It does come from being. It does come from non-being. Both are true. In book 2, he turns to the principle of motion, which he calls nature, and that turns out to be really in at bottom form. Okay, just as in book 1, change was towards form, away from privation, and in book 3, he's now going to focus on the change itself, the change towards the form, right? And here's his definition. It is, now, how to trace? I'm hesitating because if I give you the literal translation, it'll be hard to understand. If I give you the standard translation, that kind of it kind of papers over in a way what Aristotle's really talking about. So I'll give you the standard translation, then I'll show you how to think about it. It's the actuality of a thing in, I would add here, it's not in the Greek, but you have to kind of spell this out, in the mode of potentiality as in potentiality. Okay, so this is word potentiality, by the way, doesn't hurt to learn a little Greek, is dunamis. Okay, and the word for actuality is a word that Aristotle apparently made up because it didn't exist prior to, we have no record of it existing prior to his writings. I mean, it could have existed prior to him, but there's no evidence it did. And that term is entelechia, from which we got entelechy. Dunamis, we get dynamite and dynamic from that. So we inherit these words. So what does this definition mean? Okay, so entelechia is composed of n, okay, that's a prefix, plus tel, right, plus echea. All right. So the question is, what do these things mean? N refers to, it's an exoteric prefix, meaning having within. That means occurring within the essence of a thing, having within, belonging to the very essence of something, okay? And then tel has to do with an end, ultimate purpose, right? The aim. But end is really the best word. So since end is the best word, I'll put it in bold for you, okay? And echea, all right, that means to have. All right, so we sort of have the concept of having twice, but the end means having it in your very essence, not really having it, having it in your very essence. So the result of this is that entelechia means the having of the end. Within itself, having of the end within itself, within the very essence of the process. Okay. Okay. So now it's better is to talk about this. You can picture the process in your head of, on the one hand, the bronze becoming the shape of Theodore Roosevelt through the various steps being conducted by the artisan, by the sculptor, the bronze sculptor. And what do we see there? We see the bronze being changed, and that the change has an intelligible sequence, or it exhibits an intelligible sequence. It goes through a series of steps, and each step is intelligible insofar as it is what has to happen at that precise moment in order for the bronze to assume the shape of Theodore Roosevelt. So the definition of motion becomes actually the having of the end within itself of a thing, but in the motion of potentiality. That is, when you're seeing or looking at the bronze becoming the shape of Theodore Roosevelt, the end is already present in the motion insofar it is that which makes the motion intelligible as what it is. What's going on in that motion is the step-by-step process of the shape of Theodore Roosevelt coming to exist in that bronze. That okay? So in a way, that end belongs to that bronze as it's being transformed into the shape of Theodore Roosevelt. But it belongs to it in the mode of potentiality. See that? It's the actuality, or it's the entelechia, the having of the end of a thing in the mode of potentiality as in potentiality, right? The as in potentiality simply emphasizes that the end is there, but it's there in the mode of potentiality, and it'll only be there in actuality once we get to the end of the process, if that makes any sense. Okay, so that, I believe, gives you an account of that part of Aristotle. We'll let that stand, and I'll see you tomorrow.